underway in the Global Poverty Project. Absolute congratulations on the concert last night. I was very briefly backstage. I was one of the old people who was muttering, "Who do you think's on stage now?" and not quite knowing. But it was a tremendous event, so congratulations to you. Susan, thank you for having us in your very beautiful college, and that's a great story about the desk that you continue to use. Sean, I too am very much someone who values entrepreneurship, so it's great to hear about the work you're doing. And Shiv, thank you for bringing me here and for everything that you're doing in this context and far more broadly to get people interested in education, passionate about education, and to pursue the cause of leadership with an ethical and altruistic framework. You do so much, so thank you very much. To all of the young people here, I view my mission today as interesting you, particularly in education as an enabler of everything else we want to do through the global goals that have been adopted this week. Yes, education's got its own goal, but I want to persuade you not only to be interested in the specific education goal, but to view education as the foundation stone for achieving everything else. And I'm going to cite as an authority for that proposition someone as great as the Pope when he addressed the United Nations just 2 days ago. He made the point that we cannot achieve a vision of a sustainable planet in which poverty is eradicated unless we focus on education. So that's my task today. And I feel this week in New York and in everything that has led us towards this week in New York, there is a growing sense of energy and urgency around education. I felt it when I was in London with Michelle Obama, who has made girls' education her cause. I felt it in Korea at the World Education Forum in May this year, when the global community came together to sharpen our vision of education for the future. I certainly felt it in Oslo, where the Norwegian government showed so much leadership to try and get the whole world on a better path for financing education. And I've certainly felt it here this week, not only in the formal UN discussions, but in all of the side events, including, very importantly, the launching of the film about Malala, about her life and about what happened to her. So what has put education so centrally on the agenda and made it the thing that people are talking about at these global events? Well, in part, that focus is born of tragedy. It's born of the shooting of Malala and the kidnapping of the Nigerian schoolgirls. These events made the world reel in shock, but it also made the world sit up and think that if these girls can show so much courage in trying to get an education, surely as a global community, we owe them our persistence and our investment to make sure that there is an education for them to attend. I also think there's more and more evidence now about just how important education is to the rest of development and to the achievement of peace and prosperity. So, education, definitely the theme of the week. Now, if we're focusing on global education, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Let's begin with the needs. Nearly 90% of the world's school-aged children attend primary school today. That's a good thing, 90%. And there's plenty of evidence that the Millennium Development Goals in the last 15 years have galvanised global attention and enabled great progress. In fact, the number of primary school and lower secondary school-aged children who are not enrolled in school has dropped by 39%. We should never forget that statistic because it shows us that change is possible. We should celebrate that progress. But the progress to date shouldn't blind us from what now needs to be done and what the remaining problem is. And that problem has a number, 124 million. That's 124 million children of primary and lower secondary age who are not in school. 59 million of them are not in primary school. They'll never see the inside of a primary school classroom. And 31 million of those who will never see the inside of that primary school classroom are girls. And it's estimated that alongside those out-of-school children, there are around 250 million children who get some schooling, many of them 4 years of schooling, but despite that attendance at school, they are unable to acquit even the most basic literacy and numeracy benchmarks. They've sat in school, but they haven't learned. As the head of the World Bank, Jim Kim, likes to put it, and I'm going to adopt this form of words because I think it makes us think, if those 250 million children all inhabited one country, it would be the 5th largest nation on earth. So this lack of educational quality is a profound challenge and problem. They're today's statistics. What about the future? There's a problem. Is it going to be self-correcting? And is it going to be self-correcting on a time frame that we're prepared to agree with? Well, unfortunately, looking to the future, there's some painful news to absorb about how long it's going to take to equalise education gaps between the developed and the developing world. On this very vital question of quality, an esteemed education writer, Lant Pritchard, an economist at Harvard, estimates it will take at least 100 years, if not more, for children studying in developing country schools to reach the same learning outcomes as those attained today by students in developed country schools. And then UNESCO tells us, through the Global Monitoring Report, that at current rates of change, it won't be until 2111 that all children in sub-Saharan Africa complete lower secondary education. 2111. Even for the young people in the room today, you will not live to see that. That is how far away the time horizon is. Now, this pace of change is simply not acceptable. Not acceptable to me, I'm sure not acceptable to any of us. What it all adds up to is that business as usual, going through the known and predictable rate of change, allowing ourselves to accept these 100-year time horizons is nowhere near good enough. If we do that, then we fail the world's children, particularly the poorest children and particularly the poorest girls, because it is always the poorest girls who get into education last. What does all of that mean for development more broadly? This concept that education is no longer a standalone goal but key to the achievement of a prosperous, healthy and peaceful world? Well, let me give you 3 quick statistics that paint that story. First, global poverty would be decreased by 12%, meaning 171 million people would be lifted out of poverty if all students in low-income countries left school with basic reading skills. Second, if all women in all poor countries had the opportunity of a secondary education, we would see child deaths cut by a staggering 3 million lives. Third, it's been shown in Africa that educated people are 1.5 times more likely to support democracy than those with no education. And in Arab states, tolerance towards different religions increases by 14% with a secondary education. These statistics, and there are so many more like them, all point in one direction. The vision of change for the world contemplated in the Sustainable Development Agenda is simply impossible to achieve without education. So, how do we make sure we accelerate the pace of change for education? How do we get there? How do we do it? Well, my view, from the point of view of the Global Partnership for Education, is one informed by our contemporary experience. What do? Well, we're the only multilateral organisation that's solely dedicated to ensuring that all children in the world and in the poorest countries have access to a quality education. Ours is a partnership that has 60 developing country partners. We also work with civil society, donor governments, the private sector and private philanthropy. What we do with our developing country partners is work to ensure that their nations have a robust education sector plan. And in the poorest parts of the world, we help fund that plan. It's a model that helps, through partnership, to leverage knowledge and accountability, to leverage financing and advocacy to make change. And we are making change. Since 2002, we've helped 64 million children get into primary school and allocated more than $4.3 billion in grants to education. We can point to achievements in our partner countries. We can show changes in the number of children in schools, in gender parity, in the amount of money that developing country partners are spending on education. Indeed, at our pledging conference last year, we raised $2.1 billion from donor governments, but we got commitments from our developing country partners of increasing their own education expenditure by $26 billion. So a model of leverage where donor funds help leverage increased domestic expenditure. Now that all sounds like a lot of money, but according to UNESCO, the global community needs to stump up at least $39 billion more annually to educate the world's children. And make no mistake, that is the figure for external financing, what needs to come from donors, and it's been struck already assuming that developing countries are increasing their own education expenditures. So it's truly tragic to see, in the face of such a mammoth need for more resourcing, that donors' aid to education has actually been going down. It's dropped by 8% between 2010 and 2013, even at a time that overall development aid was increasing. So we need to find the political will to reverse this trend and to bridge this huge resource gap. It's not going to be easy. Persistent advocacy is going to matter, and that is, I think, where our young leaders come in. Persistent advocacy in the cause of education does change the minds of governments about the amount of resources that should be dedicated to the task. Then we have further things that we need to think through and that you can make a contribution to. The lack of resources for education is compounded by a lack of research. Donors understandably look for the best use of their own money to ensure that it's directed to what works. In turn, evidence of what works turbocharges advocacy. Part of what has enabled the cause of global health to attract donor dollars is that they've got crystal clear information about the difference that, say, for example, a vaccine will make, what it costs to deliver it, and what its delivery will save in lost lives and healthcare costs. Unfortunately, in education globally, we've seen fragmentation and a paucity of information about effective strategies for schooling and learning. Now, we've got to be careful with these comparisons. Obviously, education is different from a vaccine. A vaccine is a global good with a precise effect. In contrast, education is a locally delivered service which has to be sensitive to culture and context. And learning doesn't happen in an instant, it happens over years. And measuring outcomes and improving quality are the subject of hot debates in our own countries. So why should it surprise us that these things are also debated in developing countries as well? I believe, though, we are now poised to make some big improvements in this challenge about the information that our sector, education, has to present to the world and present to donors. I individually am involved in a project in Rwanda which is about precisely this: transparency for education, for quality and for learning outcomes. And it's not the only project that is attempting to tackle this challenge. I think the further we go into that kind of work, the more we will be able to put education in the global spotlight. There are so many things that we still need to do: advocacy, research, joining up our efforts in education and health, understanding the pivotal role that education plays to the global development agenda. Can we do it? Well, I'm incredibly confident we can. And I'm incredibly confident because what I've seen and learned, both at the Global Partnership for Education and also serving as I do as a Distinguished Fellow at the Brookings Institution in their Centre for Universal Education. We can point to the success stories. We can point to the places that have made change. pursuing the project that I have in Rwanda, I've had the opportunity to travel there, a country that was torn apart by genocide just over 20 years ago, that is now making huge improvements in education, including ensuring the school education of every boy and every girl. When we can see that kind of change, then it should hearten us for what we need to do next, what we need to do now. Can I urge you as young leaders to get involved in that challenge? I know, looking from the perspective of India, that there are still many things to do in your own nation to ensure that the children from the poorest places get a good quality education. That's important work, and work that can be done and led by young people. Through entities like the Global Poverty Project, you can leverage your voice and your advocacy to make change. Through your own researches and outreach, you can help us fill the knowledge gaps. You can invent projects that will deliver change on the ground. I know because I've seen it done, and I'm sure that there is plenty of energy in the room to do it. Can I boil this task down for you to something that I hope you can remember and take with you, and can give you a sense of how this challenge can be met? Let me throw some small numbers at you, because I've been throwing some big numbers at you, but actually sometimes the small numbers matter the most. It costs on average $1.18 in developing countries to provide a child a pre-primary, primary and secondary education. $1.18 a day to educate a child. It's not that much, is it? $1.18. You would have gone out today and spent much more than that on coffee. Developing countries are actually covering 88% of these costs. So the funding gap per child, per day, is 14 cents. 14 cents. It's not a lot of money. 14 cents to make sure that children have an education. If you can see your way to being passionate about raising that 14 cents, then you're going to change a child's life. I urge you to become involved and to do so. And I thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Karan Vaidya. I'm a member of tGELF Leaders Forum. In the tech-savvy world that we live in today, and you said that there was like a knowledge gap with education as a changing force in the world, what role do you think technology would play in the education for the people, who don't have access to it in the future? Yeah.
Sure. I think technology can play a huge role in education and in meeting this challenge in developing countries, but we've got to be clever about the use of technology. Unfortunately, in too many places, there have been programs where technology has been thought of as this big silver bullet, or perhaps you've had a private philanthropist or entrepreneur who's thought, you know, I'm the sort of person who knows about technology, so I'm going to make technology available. And because it hasn't been integrated into the whole of education, it hasn't made a difference. And, you know, many of us have heard dreadful stories about, you know, private philanthropy, well-motivated, donating hardware, giving computers to developing countries, and they now lie idle because no one knows how to use them. They've been sent to schools without electricity. They've been sent to places without adequate internet coverage, so they're not making a difference. But smart uses of technology that are well planned, and one of the reasons the Global Partnership for Education is so focused on the planning is it maximises the returns. Smart uses of technology can make a real difference. Make a real difference to the data gap that I've discussed, enabling real-time reporting. Make a real difference to the supports available for teachers, so teachers can have access to professional development and learning materials. Many classes in developing countries are being taught by someone who is not a fully trained teacher, so actually their access to support material is vital to help them teach and do what they need to in the classroom. And then we all know that for children, properly used technology is a great, fun way of encouraging learning. Now, none of us in this room, in a child in our own nations, in our own homes, would hand over to that child a mobile phone or a tablet and say, teach yourself to read. None of us would do that. But we all know that you can use devices like that to engage children, to get them learning, reading, shapes, colours, numeracy, recognising letters, and on it goes. So yes, smart deployment of technology, I think, can help developing countries leapfrog from where they are now to where we all as a global community need them to be.
Refugee camps today. This is a dreadful problem because of the language capacities of the children. So already if we can get them into English, which would probably be the best at this time, and then how to get them any kind of education at all, what do you think can be done?
You ask an incredibly important question, and the truth is, globally, we don't have all of the solutions at this time. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees does do what it can to educate and support the education of children in refugee camps. And there have been efforts, including through something very much advocated by Gordon Brown and the government of the UK, the No Lost Generation movement. There have been very major efforts to try and continue to provide education to the Syrian children who have been displaced into countries like Lebanon. But with all of the, those good intentions and those efforts, the truth is many displaced children, many refugee children, either never went to school in the country they fled from and flee and don't go into school, or tragically some of them come from countries where they used to get an education. Syria, by the standards of the region, had a good education system. Those children who used to go to school are now displaced, and thousands and thousands and thousands of them are not engaged in any schooling. The global community right now is focused on this and is doing a necessary piece of work to work out what's the best strategy to get education to children in protracted conflict and crisis. We at the Global Partnership, 50% of what we do is in fragile or conflict-affected nations, but it's going to take more resources as well as more thinking about the best way of enabling education. And to give you an insight into this refugee question, the High Commissioner for Refugees used to think that the best way of educating refugee children was to educate them with their own language and the curriculum of the country that they fled from. So the assumption was that relatively soon they would be able to go back home. So you try and keep their schooling continuous. The modern nature of today's refugee crisis is people don't go back home. People are displaced for decades. And so now they are trying to teach refugee children in the curriculum and language of the host country so that they can fit in and they can help their families fit in. So Syrian children in Turkey are being taught in Turkish and being taught Turkish curriculum, not being taught their old curriculum in Arabic. Just goes to show how long-lived these refugee problems are going to be for the world and how pivotal it is that we find a solution for the children which gives them education and opportunity in the place that they've fled to.
So this is Laura Koch. It's really inspiring what you've said, and my question is that there's a, teaching is all about teaching math, history, and all these subjects. But one of the major elements of skills that are necessary for the 21st century is empathy. And how are you focusing on that, especially to connect with the soft skills in schools that are, you have more important. Teaching all this math and things are very important, but if you don't have good citizens and teach empathy, how are we going to live in a society where there will be so many refugees coming and people from high class or low class are going to deal with each other?
That's a great question too, and one thing we most certainly do not do at the Global Partnership for Education, our secretariat is in Washington, we do not, steam out of the Secretariat in Washington into developing countries and say, we know what should be taught in your schools. We don't do that. I mean, education has to be sensitive to culture and context. Ours is a developing country-led model of change. So we work with developing countries as they plan their education systems, including planning their curriculum. But interestingly, when developing countries work their way through what they want their children taught, and when they come together in some global dialogues about learning, one of the things that has been identified as a priority by many developing countries is this teaching of citizenship skills. People want their young people to be able to understand and navigate the world in which they'll live. And they also often want a focus on peace and conflict resolution, because they come from countries where conflict has been so fresh that having young people understand how conflict can best be resolved is viewed as a very high priority. So, you know, this is certainly in the dialogue, but not in a way that is imposed by the Global Partnership for Education. And I think you've identified a really important question.
Hello, and I want to congratulate you for the great talk that you gave, and I also want to congratulate tGELF and all the good work that you guys are doing here. My name is Dr. Nish Sonwalkar. I'm from MIT Enterprise Forum and IntelliAdapt. So my comment here is, and then a question, is that technology, while is a great enabler, we often mistake that the information is education. And I think that has not served the developed world. And I've been here for 15 years working on this adaptive and online education. What we found is that learning management systems that were put in with millions of dollars in the developed nations like United States had nothing to do with learning. And so what happened is that they became an ERP for education, but what we require is what we say is personalized learning systems, or what we call adaptive learning system, which are contextualized with the nation that they are working in. So these kinds of systems are now going through, and I think the new development is coming through. Great technology innovations are happening. I recently was in Nepal and talking about the displaced people and the devastation there. What we realized that they need three things. What we call is communication, energy, and education. So we coined a new equation called G is equal to CE square. We all know E is equal to MC square. So now this is growth is equal to communication, energy, and education. So I applaud your effort, and we want to make sure the message goes everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll just agree with that.
I have a question here. I'm Tania Rodriguez. I'm coming here as a graduate of the University of Texas in Austin and as a Mexican. And we do have a lot of problems, as well as our brothers and sisters in India, about how do you keep a sustainable engagement in the youth and in the community to have this commitment to keep the change, understanding that we are the people who have the action to make the changes in our community. So my question to you is, how will you empower the generations to keep doing this great job that now they are here to learn, and to apply that into the future and to advocate that to other generations? Do you have anything to comment?
I think when, you know, I personally think about the education task and mission we're on. I mean, we focus, you know, the Millennium Development Goal has been a focus on primary school. Now we're lifting our horizons to secondary education. In many of the countries in which we work, and the developing country governments that we work with, to, you know, achieve schooling where children were, you know, reliably learning to read, write and do mathematics at a reasonable quality level would be a sea change from where those societies are now. So many of the, you know, debates that we have about curriculum and content, they're debates that in some ways, you know, fit they fit in. They've got debates that have to be had, but we can't, forget the baseline that we're starting from. Schools with classes of 80 or 100, one book between the whole class, no running water, no electricity, no sanitation facilities. These are, consequently, no capacity to think about how technology could make a difference. These are the immediate challenges. So our education planning's got to deal with those challenges. But if we deal with those challenges and ensure people are getting the foundations, then you can build on them, and the more you build on them, the more you build individuals' abilities and capacities, not for someone to empower them, but for them to have the skills and attributes that enable them to take power themselves, to become the, architects and navigators of their own life. And to give a practical example of that, the evidence is very clear. The longer a girl stays at school, the less likely it is that she will marry early. The more likely it is that she will defer having children. She will choose to have less children. So if she makes choices about her own life because education's given her the capacity to do that, then they will be a different set of choices than the ones that would tend to be imposed on her. So, and that is an intergenerational benefit. That educated mother is much more likely to have a child that survives infanthood, a child that's vaccinated, a child that attends school themselves, and that child is then going to become someone who can, grasp opportunity in their lives, and on it goes. So that, I think, is the empowerment journey for us in the countries in which we're working.
tGELF, leading the change.